Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Queen Mary, University of London. I'm Professor Colin Bailey, the President and Principal of Queen Mary. I'm delighted to be your host this evening and to be chairing the 9th Annual George Lansbury Memorial Lecture. Our guest speaker tonight is Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. There is a close relationship between Queen Mary and this important sequence of lectures ever since the George Lansbury Memorial Trust was established back in 2012. Elizabeth Hall, then a member of the Queen Mary's Governing Board, played a key part in setting up the trust. Both Queen Mary and George Lansbury have made important and lasting contributions to the history of the East End of London. Queen Mary has numerous sites in London, a history dating back to 1123, and a mission since its foundation of opening the doors of opportunity. The buildings of the People's Palace, next door to where you are seated this evening, were founded in 1887 to promote the social and cultural well-being of one of the most deprived areas of London. Although George Lansbury represented Bromley by Bow, which lay to the east of here, in what was then the neighbouring borough of Poplar, the buildings of the People's Palace would have been a familiar sight to him. The George Lansbury Memorial Trust was founded to celebrate Lansbury's contribution to local and national life. It also seeks to promote awareness to the many causes of which Lansbury campaigned. Working alongside Poplar Housing Association, to whom we are grateful for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture, the Trust has promoted a whole range of activities. This year has been particularly busy for the Trust as it marks the 100th year anniversary of the Poplar Rates Rebellion. Numerous events have been held to retell that story and to reflect on the importance and legacy of that historic episode. If you're unfamiliar with the Rates Rebellion, the story can be summarised as follows. In 1921, faced with massive unemployment in their deprived borough, the councillors of Poplar refused to pay the London County Council. The councillor's reward was to be sent to prison for contempt of court. George Lansbury commented, "If we have to choose between the contempt for the poor and contempt of court, it will be contempt of court." The unfairness of asking the poor to look after those even poorer was pointed out by Clement Attlee in September 1921, when announcing that Stepney should join Poplar's protest. Attlee, of course, went on to succeed Lansbury as leader of the Labour Party in 1935. The victory won by Poplar Rates Rebellion established the principle that meeting the needs of the welfare should be related to the ability to pay. This was an important staging post on the road to the welfare state developed under Attlee's leadership. It was a moment when local government and London government truly contributed to the national story. To reflect on that background and on local and London government, I'm delighted to welcome the Mayor of London. Like Lansbury and Attlee, Sadiq Khan served his political apprenticeship in local government as a councillor. In his case, in Wandsworth between 1994 and 2006. He was elected MP for Tooting in 2005 general election, serving as Minister of State for Communities and Local Government in 2008 to 2009, and for Transport in 2009 to 2010. He entered the shadow cabinet after the 2010 general election and among his portfolios was Shadow Minister for London 2013 to 2015. This no doubt served as a good preparation for being elected Mayor of this great city in 2016. He was, of course, re-elected earlier this year. I'm sure we're looking forward to hearing the Mayor give the 9th George Lansbury Memorial Lecture. Following the Mayor's speech, the Mayor will spend half an hour in conversation with our own Aoife Monks from our school and Department of English and Drama. Following this, we will have a short period for questions and answers from the audience after the lecture. There are microphones, so if you have a question at that point, please put up your hand and someone will bring it to you. Can I ask any questions to be short and succinct, please? And please, can they be questions, no statements, so that it's fair on everyone who wants to ask a question, because the Mayor has kindly said that he would take questions from the audience. I'm then pleased to say that we will have a vote of thanks moved by Stephen Timms, MP for East Ham, who is also chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee and member of the George Lansbury Memorial Trust Board. So without further ado, could you please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to our guest, Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Professor Bailey, for that introduction, and to Queen Mary University for hosting us this evening. It is a pleasure to be in the People's Republic of Queen Mary's this evening. Thank you also to Pippa Cattrall, the George Lansbury Memorial Trust, and to my old friend and former colleague Stephen Timms, MP, as you've heard, is the chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. He's doing a brilliant job. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me here today. I also saw as I came in, my good friend Unmesh Desai, who's the local assembly member, a former councillor, and has been an anti-racist campaigner for decades. I first got to know Unmesh in the 70s and 80s as he was marching against the National Front. Lovely, Unmesh, to have you here this evening as well. It is a privilege to have this chance to speak to you and to remember the big Labour figure that was George Lansbury. I want to start with a brief history of the man. I think George was almost as proud of being the son of a railway man as I am of being son of a bus driver. The majority of the historical accounts of George Lansbury seem to focus on his integrity and moral character. His biographer said, what made him remarkable was the stubbornness with which he clung to his principles. And I think this characteristic is what garnered Lansbury the most respect amongst his colleagues, Labour activists, and working class people at that time. And one of the main reasons he's still admired today. I remember it was the former Labour parliamentarian, Tony Benn, who placed politicians into two categories: the signposts and the weathercocks. Tony Benn put Lansbury, who he greatly admired, firmly in the category of a signpost, a conviction politician who stood firm, always staying true to his values, whatever the political consequences, compared to a weathercock whose opinion swings in the wind depending on what's most politically convenient. This notion that Lansbury was guided by his principles above all else is evident in how his short time as Labour leader came to an abrupt end. Outside Labour circles, Lansbury's probably best known from the mention he gets in the early chapters of Second World War history books when they highlight his unstinted pacifism and resignation as Labour leader in 1935, owing to his opposition to rearmament. But this is not the period of Lansbury's political career that I'm personally most interested in, or what inspires me as a politician today. Indeed, like many in the Labour Party now, as well as in Lansbury's day, his views on national defence, foreign and economic policy don't align with my own. The period of his political career I admire the most is his time in local government in London. Like me, he served as a mayor, not as Mayor of London, and to be fair to him, a position that was established not until many decades later, but as Mayor of Poplar. He was first elected in 1919 as one of a new generation of local Labour leaders in London, which included the likes of Herbert Morrison in Hackney and Clement Attlee in Stepney. Poplar's Labour administration under George Lansbury led the way in terms of tackling unemployment, hunger, and the grinding poverty that was rife at the time. He implemented a comprehensive programme of social reform and grabbed the opportunity to put Labour values into practice. This resulted in infant mortality being reduced, programmes to help the poor and unemployed, better libraries, a new council house building programme, and council workers getting paid a minimum wage of £4 a week, an increase from £1.50. And you know, there was also equal pay for women, who saw a wage rise of 70%. The aim was to make Poplar Council a model employer for others to follow. The very same approach we're taking at City Hall today. Lansbury was one of the most well-known male politicians to be a true advocate for gender equality, and I'm pleased that his name and picture was one of only 4 men put on the plinth on the statue of Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square. And by the way, there were 11 statues in Parliament Square, all men. Millicent Fawcett is the very first statue of a woman, which I commissioned in 2016 and unveiled in 2018, the centenary of women getting the right to vote. As Professor Bailey said at the outset, this year also marks another important centenary, 100 years since the Poplar Rates Rebellion, a moment in London's history that changed local government in our country forever. After the First World War, unemployment in Poplar was increasing rapidly. With no central government support for mass unemployment, help had to be funded by the council, with local people having to pay much higher tax rates than wealthier areas. In addition, Poplar was expected to collect a precept to fund local services in much better off areas of the city. The system was fundamentally unfair. Lansbury and his fellow Labour councillors decided to stop paying the money to other, richer boroughs so that the limited resources they had could be spent on the most vulnerable in their local community. For making this bold stand in favour of social justice, insisting that local councils should be funded based on need, they were willing to go to prison, and they did. This sacrifice drew attention to the unfairness with which Poplar and other poor areas were being treated, and it eventually led to major reforms that improved the lives of many poor Londoners. Lansbury's time leading Poplar is an example of the transformative power local government can have for local people and the direct benefits it can deliver to local communities. He saw firsthand the benefits of what was called municipal socialism, and this is something I'm passionate about too. We shouldn't forget that the Labour Party for a long time in its history was the party of decentralisation, of redistributing powers as well as resources. And I see pushing for greater devolution now as taking Labour back to our old roots of local democracies and civic accountability. Indeed, it was one of the key messages George Lansbury, Keir Hardie, and others in the Independent Labour Party had at the time. The famous historian R.H. Tawney, who was a Christian socialist like Lansbury, argued that a socialist society was feasible only if it was based on local decision-making. And I want to leave this idea with you as I take this opportunity to talk more about the positive power of local government today and about why I think further devolution is so important now, not only to the future of the Labour Party, but to our society as a whole. Decentralisation over recent decades has been a clear success in our country. Take London. Since the establishment of the mayoralty and the Greater London Authority, we've not looked back as a city. We've proved that devolution can work and that it can work well. There's no question that without the mayoralty or the GLA, countless achievements just wouldn't have happened. And in many respects, our city has been able to become what it is today thanks to the bold experiment that was started over 20 years ago. Just think about it. Using the Olympic Games to transform a deprived part of London into a new cultural and economic powerhouse for our city. The introduction of the world's first congestion charge, an enormous success. Ken Livingstone's cycle hire scheme, and yes, it was Ken's. and of course, the creation of Transport for London, one of the world's finest transport authorities and the envy of many cities. Over the last 5 years, I've been using the limited resources and powers as mayor to improve the lives of Londoners, following the example of Lansbury's Poplar after 1919. I've been putting Labour values of fairness, opportunity and equality at the heart of what we do, from building a record number of council homes to quadrupling the number of organisations paying the London living wage, from offering free training to unemployed and low-paid Londoners to reskill, to implementing the boldest plans to tackle air pollution of any global city, with the expanded ultra-low emission zone now double the size of Paris, covering nearly 4 million Londoners. In many areas, we're leading the way, and this isn't just the case in London. We see it across the country and around the world, with local government and cities coming up with the innovative solutions to the big challenges we face today. This dynamism stands in stark contrast to the increasingly dysfunctional character of national governments, which too often seem gripped by paralysis. In many cases, national governments have proved ill-equipped to deal with the major challenges of our time. They appear powerless in the face of globalization and powerless to respond to the needs of local citizens, too often distant from those they seek to represent. The truth is, whether it's the economy, housing, or energy, few areas need a one-size-fits-all national solution. That's why I believe that it's local government, our cities, and our regions that are the future. We're the ones who can lead the change when it comes to solving the problems of our time. One of the best examples of this is tackling climate change, a point I made at COP26 in Glasgow recently. When you compare national governments to cities over recent years, the difference when it comes to taking bold climate action is striking. It's night versus day. It's the difference between delayers and doers. We're the ones taking immediate climate action, not making promises for 20 or 30 years' time. And the same is true for a host of other areas. We're the ones creating the environment and conditions for strong and inclusive growth, linking up new housing with transport, business hubs, and green spaces to create thriving communities. We're the ones who understand the needs of local businesses and who can help to skill up young people for the green jobs of tomorrow, ensuring that no one is left behind. And we're the ones who can do most to heal the divisions within our societies by creating opportunities to bring people from different backgrounds, faiths, and races together. This last point, I believe, is another extremely powerful argument for proper devolution. The politics of blame and hatred has seeped far too deep into our national debates over recent years, with extremists prepared to exploit the lack of opportunity and the sense of insecurity in some communities. Our cities can act as an antidote to this regressive trend of political extremism and nativism. In our local authorities and cities, and indeed in universities, we can do more to bring people together to promote social integration. And by showing that we can get things done locally, we can restore some civic pride, letting people realise once again that they too have a stake in their community. Because ultimately, it will be localism and devolution rather than nationalism and greater centralisation that will mitigate us from the negative consequences of globalisation. Let me just finish with this. As I've set out this evening, local, regional government is already leading the way in many areas and is already achieving so much. But just imagine what we could do with more funding and more powers. There's so much potential just waiting to be unleashed. We can't do it without being unshackled. The idea of placing more power and decision-making closer to the people we serve is one that goes back over 100 years in the Labour Party. And I believe we should make it a powerful part of Labour's future too, with a strong offer of greater devolution at the next general election. It's telling that Labour did extremely well at the last local elections in areas like London, where we already had local leaders showing the difference that Labour can make to people's lives, and indeed in the mayoral elections too. With further devolution, we can build on this success and work to rebuild the connection that's been lost with many communities across the country. George Lansbury has been described as a true pioneer of localism. Over 100 years on, it's something that's needed now more than ever. It was a past president of the US Conference of Mayors who said, "The 19th century was a century of empires. The 20th century, a century of nation states. The 21st century will be a century of cities." It's time to truly embrace the pivotal role that cities and localism can play in creating fairer, greener, and more prosperous societies in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Sadiq, thank you so much for a fantastic lecture. for joining us today. Welcome to Queen Mary. I'm going to talk to the audience for a minute.
Great.
That's all right. You can have a glass of water. I would just want to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Aoife Monks, and I'm the university's head of arts and culture. I'm thrilled to be able to have some conversation before we open up to questions. And I just wanted to say something about that before we started. First of all, to say hello to those of us here who are actually joining us on our online campus. So there are many other witnesses to this conversation. The other thing to say is that the history of this campus is founded in the spirit of the People's Palace, which was established in 1887 for the education and the entertainment of the people of East London. So this is your space. Welcome to your space. We try and live that mission of inclusion in all the things we do here. And I just wanted to think about that for our questions, which is to get ourselves ready, because when we open up to audience questions, there's often a sort of awkward silence and a bit of dry-mouthed nervousness. And there are probably people here, students perhaps included, who think that the idea of asking a question in front of this many people is horrifying. So I just wanted to say this, that we often need to hear most from the quietest voices. And if you can pluck up the courage to join us in this conversation, please do. For those of you who love speaking in public, and some of you do it professionally, I would like to reiterate Colin's invitation to keep your points brief so that we can accommodate those quieter voices and make space for them. And in all cases, whether quiet or loud, I would ask us all to offer our questions respectfully, not only for sort of woolly liberal reasons of being nice, but actually precisely because quieter voices find it hard to be heard when the situation they're in is adversarial. And I think we can see that in evidence at times in the Houses of Parliament. So get yourselves ready. In about 20 minutes or so, we'll be turning to you. But I'm just going to turn to some questions for a conversation rather than questions.
Sure.
And I wonder if I could actually start by thinking about that history of the People's Palace, because of course it has a certain kind of Fabian history. What I always like is, even though it was built in 1887, it actually first appeared in a novel in 1881 written by Walter Besant, whose sister-in-law was Annie Besant, a really leading speaker for the Fabian Society. So the histories and origins of this campus really have their origins in a kind of Fabian legacy. And I wonder if I could ask you what a modern Fabian is and how the legacies of that thinking has shaped your approach to governing London.
Well, firstly, I love the idea of the People's Palace to educate and entertain. I hope the current mayor is an educator, because the previous mayor was clearly an entertainer. That's me being polite on the strictures of Dr. Monk. But look, listen, I'm a proud Fabian. I had the pleasure and privilege of being chair of the Fabian Society, the oldest think tank in the world, for 3 years. One of the great things about the Fabian is we are a membership organisation. So yes, we're a think tank fizzing with ideas and policy, but also we listen to our members and what members are thinking about. And my values come from, of course, being a Labour member, but also being a Fabian and a variety of other things that are meshed into my identity. And being a Fabian basically, means that you walk the walk. We are the keeper of our brother. It's the golden thread that goes through the major religions, it goes through Fabians. Treat others how you want to be treated. The principles that Lansbury talks about of equality, respecting others is really important. And being a Fabian also means listening. One of the great things about the founders of the Fabian Society is they spent time with Londoners who were less well off than them, deprived communities, and they listened. And that's one of the things I think we've lost as professional politicians. I mean, Unmesh, Stephen accepted. We don't really listen to what people are saying, and we don't hear what people were saying. We've lost this ability to empathise, right? And that's one of the great things about the Fabians. People's lived experiences influence our policy. That's why being a membership organisation is really important. And so I'm incredibly proud to be a Fabian. And for those that aren't members, very, very competitive membership rates. And I'd encourage you all to join.
Excellent. And actually that idea of listening to lived experience brings us very nicely, I think, to the fact that we are living in the centenary of the Popular Rates Rebellion, which of course is what your lecture has just honoured so well. And I just wanted to offer a quote from one of the activists during the rebellion, who said that ours has been a class movement simply because only our class lives in Poplar. And I'm so struck by the kind of deliberate and valuable parochialism of Londoners, the way that we're so identified with our boroughs as well as with the city. And I wonder how you understand your role as Mayor of London. Are you actually governing a single city in practice, or are you governing multiple cities with so many different boroughs, constituencies, different needs? How do you navigate between that diversity in central government?
I think I'm in danger of taking the next 40 minutes answering that question. But can I just say, for those who are at Queen Mary who aren't from London, you don't realise how lucky you are to be at this university. Why do I say that? Because you literally have more diversity in and around Queen Mary than in most parts of the globe. Diversity in terms of ethnicity and religion, of course, socioeconomic background, sexual orientation, and we can go on and on and on, right? And that is a huge advantage in the 21st century with globalization, but also it's an opportunity in relation to what you can learn outside the lecture theatre, as wonderful as your lectures are and as useful as they are, Colin. One thing about London is our diversity. For me, it's a strength, not a weakness. You look at New York, New York's got 5 boroughs, right? And when Ken first became mayor, Ken wanted London to be simplified. 32 boroughs is really complicated. And there's about 2,000 councillors. You've got 25 assembly members, you've got 73 MPs. And of course, we all love each other, we all agree on everything. I wish. And so one of Ken's ambitions was to move towards 5 boroughs, to make life easier being the mayor of London. Obviously, huge resistance, didn't happen. Boris Johnson, on the other hand, simply ignored the councils and boroughs and the MPs and so forth, as indeed he does as Prime Minister, incidentally. What I've tried to do over the last 5 years is to work with them, whatever political persuasion, whether you're outer or inner. I mean, Romford is different to Camden, Tower Hamlets is different to Sutton. And we've got different rhythms and beats in our city. Someone once said we're 400 villages and stuff. I think they're probably right. I'm a South Londoner. I mean, East London is very different to South London. But there are many things we've got in common. And as mayor, what I've tried to do is spend lots of time out and about, right? And one of the things I'm doing, and I'm really proud of doing, is moving City Hall from the palatial offices I have by Tower Bridge to the east of London to help regenerate East London, to help regenerate the Royal Docklands, but also because the centre of our city is moving east, in my opinion. And so I'm looking forward to that. And I think it's really important that we understand the rhythm of the greatest city in the world. And, there's lived experiences, there's shared experiences, and then there's, walking in the shoes of others through empathy. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the mayoralty is only 21 years old. We've gone from being stroppy teenagers to about to graduate. And we need some good careers advice. And so I spend lots of time talking to mayors around the world who've had mayoralties longer to see how we go forward.
I mean, we're looking forward to welcoming you as our neighbour when you join us in East London. And actually, that leads me nicely on to asking you to think a bit more with us about your mention of municipal socialism in Lansbury's kind of legacies, which is such a powerful concept. From what I understand, at least, the notion of kind of community wealth creation, the idea of a sort of decentralised approach, relies on anchor organisations within a particular area to do their part. And I wonder what role you think universities play in that. So how can universities contribute to the development of municipal socialism? What's our job, do you think?
Universities are crucial. One of the things that I've always said as mayor is I don't want to live in a city of Philistines, right? I want to live in a city people enjoy culture, they enjoy technology, they believe in learning for the sake of learning, but also learning leading to good jobs. One of the things that this awful pandemic did was it both exposed and exacerbated the structural inequalities in our city, right? Disproportionately, it was Black, Asian, minority ethnics dying more than others because of COVID. Look at those who lost their jobs, look at those in the front line, not given the proper personal protective equipment and so forth. So what I've tried to do is to ensure that the recovery is one that is a fair one. So one of the things we've done is, for the first time ever, started to work with London partners and get rid of the silos. And we had this thing called the London Recovery Board. I co-chair with the chair of London Councils, Georgia Gould, the leader of Camden Council. And we've got on part of that recovery board, higher education sector. We've also got anchor institutions like the NHS, TfL, the police, faith communities, NGOs, civic society, Trust for London, and many, many others, to try and make sure we work together about what are the priorities for our city. And the great thing about universities is it isn't just the undergraduates and the postgraduates. You basically are your own ecosystems. Think about those wonderful people who are looking after our coats, doing the, in the cloakroom. Those wonderful people making sure we're safe doing the security, or those who will clean up after us and minimise the chances of your students catching COVID tomorrow because things have been properly cleaned. And we want to work with the universities to make sure our recovery is a green one, is a fair one. And there's a horrible saying, which actually is a really good saying, which is never waste a crisis. It was in fact attributed to Churchill during the Second World War. And this awful pandemic does provide opportunities. And one of them is universities working closely with other colleagues in the city, City Hall working with other colleagues in the city to make sure our recovery is a green one, a fair one, and a just one.
I know that Queen Mary is very committed, again, I suppose, through our mission around leading the civic university agenda and thinking about our responsibilities in this area. And as you say, they've become so much more urgent during the pandemic. And that, I suppose, leads me to my next question, which is your mention of the question of fairness and unfairness, because, of course, George Lansbury led a movement that really tried to tackle the unfairness of the taxation system in his moment. And I'm struck by the fact that the right have co-opted a certain kind of language of fairness with things like their levelling up agenda, the idea that they're restoring a certain kind of fairness. I'm wondering, could you talk to us a little bit about what you think the levelling up agenda means for London, particularly perhaps for boroughs like Tower Hamlets and East London? What do you see happening around that policy?
So what the government's done, and actually this is one of my points about cities being the antidote to populism and nativism, is they've co-opted this language which allows them to divide communities to garner public support. North versus South, old versus young. We can think of other examples that they've done in relation to the various wars they have, whether it's a culture war or whatever. But let's remind ourselves that people in this borough don't just have 2 jobs, sometimes they've got 3 jobs, simply to make ends meet, to put food on the table and to keep their homes warm. Well, those in Parliament have 2 or 3 jobs, not for that reason, but because they're greedy and corrupt and they're sleazy. I think we've got to appropriate the language again. But also it's worth reminding those of both mainstream parties, the Labour Party and the Tory Party, who try and pit North versus South. 9 out of the 10 poorest wards in the country, poorest boroughs in the country, are in London. The idea that the streets in London are paved with gold and it's the land of milk and honey is nonsense. And, I blame actually people in my own party up in the north who play to the galleries in the north by slagging off London. Listen, I think one of the most patriotic things you can do is to be proud of your capital city. And one of the things you've got to do if you believe in social justice and equality is to both highlight and address the inequalities in our city. I was really proud this week to announce an increase in the London living wage. It's now £11.05 an hour. It was, it's an increase of almost 20% since I became mayor. But 1 out of 5 Londoners still don't earn the London living wage. Right? And so they've got a £20 cut in universal credit. They've got national insurance going up next April. They've had a record increase in energy prices. Rent is going up. Inflation is going up. That's real poverty in London. And that's why it's so important for us to call out those that, try and pit North versus South or one area versus another. And there's, and we've got to, I don't believe you level up our country by dragging London down. I don't believe the way to make a country more equal is by making London poorer. And it's really important that you mentioned one of the roles of the People's Palace is to educate. We've got to educate people what's really happening so they know what's really happening rather than politics based upon ignorance and populism.
I'm actually mindful that George Lansbury was known for producing or inventing popularism, which was around the reintroduction of fairness in the taxation system. So perhaps we should be replacing popularism with popularism. I'm also struck, you mentioned COP26, and of course we're sort of living in the immediate aftermath of that moment. Lansbury, of course, was a staunch supporter of the League of Nations, which was the first worldwide intergovernmental organisation. And I was thinking of how resonant that is with COP26. And I'm wondering what you see. You mentioned this briefly in your speech, but would you share a little bit more on what you think the role of cities compared to national governments is when it comes to tackling climate change?
Well, one of the things I think we've got to accept with the best one in the world is the interconnectedness of our planet and our country. There are some things we can't solve on our own. Good example is terrorism. Right? Terrorists don't respect national boundaries. Another example is climate change. Climate change, toxic air, doesn't respect national boundaries. Right? And so we have to work together. One of the lessons from the League of Nations is that it was actually a failure because it didn't prevent the Second World War happening. The question we've got to ask ourselves, I'm somebody who believes in internationalism and believes in multilateralism, is the United Nations destined to be a failure like the League of Nations because it fails to address climate change? And that's why COP26 was so important. That's why COP27 is so important, because when you meet brothers and sisters from the global south, forget flash flooding in London leading to 31 stations having to close down, or some flats being flooded, horrible though it was, and the overheating we're experiencing in our city. In the global south, you're seeing waters rising, which means villages going underwater. You're seeing displacement of people, migration caused by climate change. You're seeing heat waves. You're seeing wildfires. And we're now starting to see those in Europe as well. And so it's really important for the international community through the UN to walk the walk rather than making promises for 2055. Who of us believes Boris Johnson will be around in 2050 as Prime Minister, right? So it's easy. That's why one of the themes during my COP26 trip to Glasgow was to try and say, listen, we're the doers, the cities, the national countries are delayers. We've got to help provide the solutions to the issue of climate change. And in London, we're leading the way, whether it comes to air pollution with the ULEZ, or whether it comes to climate change in relation to electric buses, electric taxis, more walking, more cycling, retrofitting our building. We can't do it alone. And if Johnson is serious about fighting climate change, and the same goes for respective leaders in USA with Biden, in France with Macron, in Germany with Merkel, in Xi in China, Modi in India, they've got to give powers to cities and regions who can take action.
I'm just thinking about the fact that our research centre in Brazil commissioned an indigenous person to come and make an anthropological film about Londoners. So they brought them over. Of course, the tradition is anthropologists make films about indigenous people. And this amazing man, Takuma, came over and made a film about us. So perhaps an indigenous version of London might offer us some insights. We're very happy to share that.
Absolutely.
I wonder if we could think a little bit more also about Lansbury's emphasis on mutualism, on local cooperation. I'm struck by research done by Gillian Rose in our geography department about the ways that his socialism harnessed cooperation that was already at work in the community in Poplar and sort of rallied that to do this amazing work. And it struck me that recently the potential of that mutual cooperation really showed up in the pandemic, the ways that Londoners turned out and helped each other. And I wonder, again, I know you mentioned this in your speech, but could you tell us a little bit more about both the policies you think that might be grown out of that experience and also the missed opportunities that you see perhaps in central government?
Yeah, well, look, this week, I talked about the London living wage. That whole movement began in the east of London, in this borough. I think Unmesh and Stephen were around 20 years ago. They don't look it. 20 years ago, when citizens first arose, people coming together, mosques, churches, temples, those in factories, those in bus garages, small businesses, big businesses coming together. And there are now more than 9,000 living wage employees across the country, 2,400 in London, and it's really game places, right? People coming together, organising. That's why I'm somebody who believes so passionately about trade unions as a force for good, people coming together, collective organisations, collective organising, and so forth. In the pandemic, you're spot on. We saw the best of that in relation to mutual aid. So what we saw is, if you remember, you could think back to March 2020. People were told to stay at home, and the laws were changed to enforce lockdown. Think about the older people helped during this time by food being provided, by people dropping off, tablets they could communicate virtually, and so forth. A really, really good example of people coming together. The sort of, clapping for carers was just, if you can park that almost. All the other stuff, tangible differences that we made. It also helped highlight some of the catastrophic errors being made. Social care workers not being given the right personal protective equipment. Test and trace not working, breaking down, because not done locally. No support given for those required to self-isolate. Many in the gig economy who are self-employed, if they don't work, they don't get paid, can't put food on the table, and so forth. I think some opportunities were missed, but actually in London, the recovery board model I'm talking about is trying to capture the best of civic society. We're doing work with with faith and community groups across London, giving them help with grants and others, because we think if they're empowered, they can do far, far more. At least a really good social capital, their sense of solidarity, their sense of community, their sense of belonging. But actually, it's a lot cheaper than it being done from the centre, from City Hall and the council. So there's a win-win.
Brilliant. I think that's a really good note to open up to the audience. So this is your moment now. I think we have some roving mics, is that right? Which are being carried by roving students. So thank you to our students for roving for us. I think we'll take questions in groups of 3, if that's all right. So we might just gather up some questions and then take them in turn. So we have a hand over here just behind you, and there's 2 hands down here. Just to remind you that let's make sure that quieter voices get heard and to encourage those quieter voices to speak up. Lovely.
Thanks, Sadiq. I'm Lee. You teased us a little bit because no fewer than twice, if not 3 times, you mentioned if you had more powers as mayor. So I wonder if you can suggest to us what sort of powers you'd like, please.
Great, thank you. And maybe we've got one here. And could we have a couple, just some microphones down here, please? So we'll take this side first, I think.
Mindful of the county...
So what's your name?
John.
John.
Mindful of the County Hall inscription, seat of London government, what is your opinion of London now having a mayor of the city, another city in Westminster, 33 London boroughs, and you as mayor? And finally, will your departure from your architecturally acclaimed City Hall lead to it having the same ignominious fate as the County Hall, now a hotel?
So we have a question here. We'll take that as the last of the 3, the first 3.
Hi Sadiq, thank you for that lecture. I'm Shebul Khan, I work at Popular Harker. I'll be very careful what I say. My boss sitting here. He's an ardent cyclist. When Popular Harker take initiatives in kind of closing roads to provide a pedestrian and cycle lanes, how much support can we get from your office?
Support for
making sure that we get that cycle lane.
Fine. Okay, thank you for those questions. Lee, I've got a long list of powers that I'd like. Firstly, I should be called El Presidente. Really important. I want to build a bridge from here to Scotland. Make sure it doesn't pass through any Brexit areas. But on a serious note, look, the previous mayor, a guy called Boris Johnson, he set up a commission called the London Finance Commission, and he got experts on a cross-party basis to look at what powers London should have. I think it's not a bad report, actually. So the starting point would be Boris Johnson's London Finance Commission. The sort of stuff he mentioned, Lee, was fiscal devolution, some of the property taxes retaining in London, powers in relation to tourism, and so forth. I'll give you an amazing stat, which is in London, we get to spend 7% of taxes raised in our city. New York gets to spend 50%, Tokyo is 70%. And I've got no problems, by the way, because we have the broadest shoulders, carrying the greatest burden. So I've got no problem us contributing £40 billion net to the Treasury. I think it is important we help support other parts of the country who are less well off. My argument is if we've got more powers to raise revenues, we've got more devolution, the slice of the cake that we contribute towards the country could be even bigger, because I think we'd know how better to spend that money than civil servants in Whitehall love them as we do. But the LFC report was a starting point. We updated it, by the way, when I became elected mayor. Look, John, listen, I've got no problem with 33 mayors, with the City of London Corporation, and so forth. It's not a problem at all. I think one of the things you've got to do is believe in collaboration. Competition is all well and good, and I'm somebody who's very competitive normally, but you can work together and achieve a lot. I've never thought devolution is taking power away from people lower down than you, so like councils and wards. That's not devolution. Devolution is giving power down. And so, for example, what we've done lots of work around devolving some of that transport budgets down to communities. I'll come to the question shortly about cycling and stuff, and you shouldn't be afraid of that. And one of the things we've tried to do is involve people in some of our decisions. So, for example, we set up a Young Londoners Fund of £70 million to try and deal with the causes of crime, giving young people constructive things to do so they're not joining criminal gangs or getting up to no good, football, culture, sport, education. And we've got local communities helping decide how that's spent, including some of their 33 friends in other boroughs. And look, look, City Hall is a gorgeous building. I mean, it was designed by a star architect, Norman Foster, right? It's a great building. Not the last James one, the one before Spectre, right? The baddie's thrown off the staircase in City Hall. Not baddie. The second to last Harry Potter was filmed there. But listen, I can't justify spending £20 million taxpayers' money on my palatial office with the best view in London, right? But secondly, if I can go to the east of London in a property we own and help regenerate one of the poorest parts in Europe, I'm going to do that, right? Because it's about ensuring you use the power of the office to do good. It is a gorgeous office, by the way. It really is. Left in a mess by the previous guy, but we've sorted that out. Look, it's really important, the agenda you're talking about. So let's just go backwards a sec. We are a Roman town, Roman city, right? We've evolved over more than 1,000 years. We're not like other cities in the globe, which have been designed in a grids way, designed for the people there. And we've evolved, and Great London's got bigger. But our roads are basically the Roman roads. Our population is now north of 9.25 million, on some days north of 10 million. It simply isn't possible for everyone to drive around, particularly now that people are ordering stuff home or ordering stuff to work with the delivery services, with the blue light services, and so forth. So we've got to use the finite space we have in a sensible way. We've got to ration it, right? And the best way to ration it, that's addressing climate change and air pollution, is to encourage as many people as possible to walk, cycle, use public transport. That's why I froze fares for 5 years. Why? Because we want people to make it so it's attractive to come back to public transport. We've got to make it safer, though, for people to cycle, and easier. I used to cycle as a boy, didn't as an adult, it wasn't safe, right? We've now increased 5-fold the amount of safe cycling lanes. We've increased by 21,500 the amount of meterage people to walk on, and we've made sure we've got 300 school streets, working with councils around active travel, working with councils around policies to encourage people to walk, cycle, use public transport. It's so important that we avoid a car-led recovery. One of many reasons is the gridlock will cause people driving, but also it's replacing one health crisis, a COVID crisis, with another one, poor quality air. And that's why I'm saying to the government, you need to give us support with TfL, right? TfL, I reduced the deficit by 71% before the pandemic. I increased the cash balances. We reduced operating costs, but the pandemic meant fewer people using our services. We needed support from the government. And the government's got to give us support, because if they don't give us support, it means services are being cut, less buses, less tubes, people back in their car. You don't get a national recovery without a London recovery. You don't get a London recovery without TfL firing all cylinders. And that's why it's so important that this idea of levelling up, meaning dragging London down, isn't one that snowballs, because it's dangerous for London, dangerous for our country, and dangerous for those who want to cycle as well.
I'm becoming aware of time, but we want to hear some more voices. So I wonder, could we take this person here and this person right in the middle here? Do we have another microphone? Oh, could we have another microphone down here, please? We have a speaker right in the middle, speaker there, and let's think, and the speaker here as well. So do we have a final microphone, or do we only have two? Two? Okay, perfect. So we start here.
Thanks. My name is Laura. I am a climate justice campaigner with Green Indoor Rising. Yay. You've spoken a lot tonight about the importance of principles in politics, and you've spoken about your principle of being a climate justice principle. Don't you think that that should result in stopping the building of the Silvertown Tunnel, which is just going to result in more air pollution, more cars on the road, and more climate change?
Sure.
Thank you. And then we have a speaker here. So we get the microphone down to the middle of the aisle. Just here. Did you want to put your hand up again? Sorry, the person in the mask. Yeah, there we go. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Building on what Laura said, not only will you commit to stopping the construction of...
Sorry, I can't. I'm sorry. I think it's... I can't.
Also, when you commit to stopping the construction of the Silvertown Tunnel, will you also improve infrastructure in London to accommodate for more buses, less cars on the road, more stations of the Oyster, the Transport for London, increasing the tube to towns maybe more outside of London, like Epping, going further out with the Oyster programme, and it just generally improving infrastructure not only in London but outside of London too.
Lovely, thank you. So we have one question down here, and then we'll finish those three. Just down here. There we go.
Actually, I have 3 questions.
Oh, could you stick to one, please?
Do one question in 3 parts.
Yeah, okay. That's exactly what I was going to do. On devolution, you were talking about cities. So what happens to people who don't live in cities? Is there a potential for conflict or unfairness there? And coupled with that is, way back in the Blair government, when there was an attempt to set up a regional devolution in North East England, I think, one of the reasons it was not voted for was people didn't want the additional cost of another layer of local government. And I'm afraid I can't not ask, what do you mean by devolution? How far would you go? Scotland?
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me do all 3 of those. Thank you for those questions. That one question in 3 parts in particular. Look, Laura, I've never described myself as a climate justice activist, but thank you for giving me that description. I'll take it. So let me show you the problem with South East London, where the community is ill-served by Victorian infrastructure. The community in South East London, which I care about passionately, and spent lots of time there, is one which is served by a tunnel called the Blackwall Tunnel. It's a Victorian tunnel more than 150 years old.
What about the community in Newham? The most polluted borough in London.
Sure.
I think that's also good for part of the
Sure.
It's interesting you haven't actually mentioned it.
Sure. Do you want me to answer the question, then you can ask me another one?
Yeah.
Okay. So that community in southeast London, and that includes on both sides of the river, including Newham, is currently served by the Blackwall Tunnel, which is a Victorian tunnel built more than 150 years ago that has a curve in it, so the horses and carts weren't scared by the light and didn't bolt. That's how old it is. On a normal year, that tunnel, which serves Newham, closes 700 times a year on average, sometimes more than 700, sometimes a bit less. A 3-minute closure leads to a 5-mile tailback, which affects the community you claim to care about, and other parts of southeast London, which leads to poor air pollution, leads to congestion and increase in nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, and carbon emissions. The most unreliable bus in the city is a single-decker bus that uses the Blackwall Tunnel. So the option I was given when I became mayor was a tunnel which wasn't fit for purpose, and would have led to poor quality air, worse air, and didn't give any public transport solutions. The Silvertown Tunnel has a lane reserved for double-decker buses, 37 an hour going through the Silvertown Tunnel. The Silvertown Tunnel will be in the expanded ultra-low emission zone. It will also be covered by a toll, as will the Blackwall Tunnel, and there'll be air quality monitors, both looking at NOx, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate matter in different parts of Newham, Silvertown, this side of the river, and the other side of the river. One of the conditions of the development consent order is air quality must not get worse, it must improve. The annual cost to the National Health Service runs into the hundreds of millions of pounds by respiratory issues caused by people breathing in the air in those parts of London because of the congestion and the poor quality air. This is a solution, a pragmatic solution to the challenges in that part of London. So what we're going to do is encourage more people to use public transport. And in the new Silvertown Tunnel, there'll be 37 double-decker buses going through the tunnel, hopefully electric by then. We've got more electric buses of any city in Western Europe, and we've ordered more as well. And the advantage of our electric buses, besides leading to less carbon emission, less NOx and less particulate matter, is they create jobs in other parts of the country. It's one of the reasons why we're trying to persuade the government to invest in electric buses, because these buses are made in Falkirk in Scotland, in Ballymena in Northern Ireland, in Scarborough and in Leeds. A good example of reducing carbon emissions, of creating jobs, but also helping with congestion and people giving a good alternative to driving their car. Last year, I was the mayor that stood up to the government when they asked me to take away free travel for children and those above the age of 60, because I made the point, how can you encourage people to leave their cars at home if you're taking away free travel for them? I'm more than happy, by the way, to invest outside of London. In fact, the new Crossrail, when it opens next year, will serve cities and regions outside of London, to the east and to the west, but it needs resources. And we've got a situation where in 3 weeks' time, TfL will run out of money because of the short-term deal running out. And so not only will we not be able to do what we need to do in relation to electric buses, but other projects like the Bakerloo Line extension, other projects in relation to improving infrastructure will have to be sacrificed, but also some of the things we're already doing will have to stop as well. So that's why I say to the government, it's a false economy not to support London. You don't get a national recovery without a London recovery, and you don't address climate change and air quality without investing in public transport as well. You raised a really important question in relation to cities. Those people live in communities that aren't cities. And one of the things I've noticed speaking to colleagues across the globe is there is this disconnect between, in particular, capital cities and other parts of the country. If you think there's an anti-London feeling across the country, speak to the French about Paris. It's very similar to the challenges we have. But you're spot on about those that live in towns and villages, particularly coastal towns versus cities. There's a really good organisation called UK 100. Polly Billington is the head of that. And what she's done is brought together these different communities, and they include London as well, because we've got to look about the things that we have in common. We don't want a cities versus rural or a capital city versus the country. And there is so many things. Public transport is a really good example. I mean, we all quibble when we've got to wait a few minutes for a bus or the tubes, not every 30 seconds. You should try to live in villages and towns outside of London. I mean, and that's why I make the point to the government, actually it's not a zero-sum game, because we can create the jobs in other parts of the country, because we haven't got the expertise, factories or skills to build these buses, or the electric taxis, or the cycle hire stuff. Other parts of the country do, but also we can work together because of the economies of scale, reducing the costs of this for other parts of the country to also benefit as well. And a lot of people who live in other parts of the country come into London for their work or their study or their family here as well. And we've got to look at things that bring us together rather than the easy option in pitting city versus the red wall seats is a good example, or coastal towns or elsewhere as well. You're right about John Prescott tried to have regional assemblies. There was a referendum and it failed. That doesn't mean that devolution is a bad idea. That particular model gave the impression of another layer of bureaucracy and the flabbiness. But actually, I'll give you an example of where we save money. The Department of Education used to be in charge of adult education. That's further education, those above the age of 19. They gave that to us, and we're getting better value for money than the DFE were by devolution. So it's not the case that devolving services to communities is more expensive, you can be pro-devolution and believe in the nation state. So I'm somebody who believes in the power of the union. I'm very proud that our buses are made in Falkirk. I'm looking forward to going back to Glasgow as soon as I can. I love London as a Scottish heritage, doing a great job in London and vice versa. I'm not somebody who believes that the way to make our country stronger is by Scotland separating from our country. It's not about me patronising the Scottish about not being good for Scotland. I think it's bad for us. I think it's really bad for us losing one of our limbs, which is what Scotland would be if we lost Scotland. And we've got to argue the patriotic case to impress upon our Scottish friends why we need them, not them needing us. I think that's the wrong argument to have, although it was one in 2014. That's quite patronising. And it's the same argument I make with other people in the country. I'm not saying that, we're the golden goose that lays the egg. I'm saying we need you to have, factories in West Midlands building our taxis. We need you in Coventry building our taxis. We need your factories in Scarborough, Ballymena, Northern Ireland. So it's got to be an equal partnership approach, because I think up until now it's been quite arrogant from those of us in the capital city.
I'm aware of time, so I'm actually going to pass over to Zainab, who's going to introduce the vote of thanks by Stephen Timms. But I'd just like to make my own tiny vote of thanks to Sadiq for speaking so eloquently, and I wanted to also say thanks for your great service to our city.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I would just like to say thank you to the Mayor of London for marking this centenary and having an insightful conversation on a key historical event that happened not just too far from Queen Mary. There are so many lessons that we can learn about George Lansbury and his politics, and for students that is quite relevant. And thanks for sharing your visions on local government, on cities, equality, and your work on climate change. We deeply appreciate your hard work as mayor, to be honest, and your constant engagement with and enthusiasm for communities in and around London. And lastly, just to say thank you for coming to Queen Mary. Not every day do you get to meet the Mayor of London, so thank you. And I'd like to give a warm welcome to Stephen Timms, a dutiful member of the Parliament for East Ham. Stephen entered Parliament in 1994 and has held a number of ministerial positions as Labour Party's Faith Envoy, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, exiting the European Union Select Committee, and your hard work on pensions and Work and Pensions Select Committee. And without further ado, welcome Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Zainab, very much. And on behalf of the George Lansbury Memorial Trust, thank you, Sadiq, very much for joining us this year, for setting out such a powerful case for localism. We've had a busy year in the Trust as we've had a series of events marking the centenary of the Popular Councillors' Rebellion. So we're particularly grateful that you're willing to join us this year and to make it such a special event for us. Sadiq emphasised the outstanding principled stance which George Lansbury took really throughout his political career. It is very striking, I think, how much Lansbury still inspires people today, all these decades on. And we are particularly pleased to have a number of members of the Lansbury family with us this evening, and a number of members of the family who support the work of the Trust. There are lots of very good reasons to celebrate the memory of George Lansbury. Courageous defiance of the powers that be, as we've been reminded this evening, in support of the hard-pressed voters he represented. He was one of the very first Labour cabinet ministers and did a very effective job. And he was the leader who rebuilt the Labour Party after the Ramsay MacDonald betrayal and paved the way for the great reforming Labour government after the war, led by his political neighbour, Clement Attlee. But another reason for celebrating George Lansbury, which is important for many of us, is that he was, as Sadiq mentioned, a Christian socialist. A key starting point for his politics was his religious faith. He was a member of Bow Church just along the road. And one thing I want to thank Sadiq for is very consistently recognising the validity and the value of religious faith as a starting point for political engagement. And you've mentioned that this evening. If we look today, where can we find the capacity to change things for the better in Britain? We can do no better than look at people serving their communities in churches and mosques and temples and synagogues in every part of the country. And Sadiq has always consistently recognised that. We had a great Zoom event, one of the events this year. This was one evening in September when we heard from descendants of the very ordinary yet extraordinary people who went to prison as popular councillors in 1921. We heard from the great-granddaughter of George and Nellie Cressel. Nellie was 7 months pregnant when she went to prison. She survived the experience and she was a councillor locally until 1965. We heard about her from her great-granddaughter who remembers her well. We heard from the great-nephew of Albert Baker. He was a railwayman who went to prison as a popular councillor. From the grandson of Charlie Sumner, who was a trade union official on popular council, who went to prison. And we heard from Nigel Wiskin, great-grandson of George Lansbury, who showed us a newspaper photograph of himself, aged 3, sitting on the lap of his famous great-grandfather. But hearing from those descendants was a really powerful reminder of the remarkable things that democracy enables ordinary people to achieve. Can I encourage you, if you're in a position to do so, to make a donation to the work of the George Lansbury Memorial Trust by putting some notes or a cheque or some coins into one of the 2 hats which are over here and which will be at the door as you leave. We always pretend these are hats that were worn by George Lansbury. In fact, they weren't, but you get the idea. And that appeal to contribute comes from Chris Sumner, the aforementioned grandson of Charlie Sumner, who's the treasurer of the trust. The Popular Councillors' Revolt was an early example of events in East London having very big national and international impact. Unmesh Desai, who's with us this evening, is leading a campaign from City Hall on London moving east. And we are all really looking forward to Sadiq moving into the Crystal Building in the Royal Docks in the new year. And what I hope we can all do is recommit ourselves to standing up for ordinary people in this part of London and everywhere, and working alongside Sadiq to change things for the better, as George Lansbury and his colleagues did so powerfully and so courageously 100 years ago this year. Thank you.
Lovely to have you. He's very good.
So we're coming towards the end of the formal part of this evening. I'd just like to make just 2 quick comments, if I may. You heard Sadiq talk about the London living wage, but just to remind everyone that was founded out of Queen Mary, based on research on the living wage and the London living wage. So I can't resist just promoting Queen Mary on that. The other thing I would like to say was, as a university, we were going to move into the Crystal, but we were trumped then by Sadiq Khan. So unfortunately, we had to find another location for our Institute of Technology. I could carry on all night, but let me just say thank you, Stephen, for your words and vote of thanks. Sadiq, thank you for your presentation and for your conversation and answering the questions. Aoife, thank you for being in conversation with Sadiq, but thank you as the audience for asking your questions, and thank you for those online. Now, as we come to the end of this evening, I would ask you just to remain seated while I just escort our guest, the Mayor, and Aoife out of the room. But we have refreshments outside for everyone. I would ask you to enjoy yourself. If you feel comfortable, please leave your masks on, of course. But we've got refreshments outside to about 8:30. So thank you again. But can I just ask you to remain seated while I just escort our guest and Aoife outside? Thank you.